The Forbidden Book, Medieval Europe Tried to Erase. There are books that change how people think, and then there are books so dangerous that entire civilizations decide they must never be read. In medieval Europe, one such book became an obsession, a threat, and finally, a target. It was not banned because it was false. It was not erased because it lacked credibility. It was hunted because it worked, because it asked questions medieval society could not safely answer. Church authorities warned against it. Monasteries locked it away. Inquisitors searched for copies, and yet it kept reappearing, hidden in private libraries, copied in secret, encoded in symbols. This was the forbidden book medieval Europe tried to erase. Its exact title changed depending on who mentioned it. Sometimes it was described as a work of ancient wisdom, sometimes as a book of forbidden science, sometimes as a dangerous synthesis of pagan knowledge, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, knowledge that did not fit Christian doctrine but refused to disappear. What made this book terrifying was not heresy alone. It suggested that the universe operated according to laws that did not require divine intervention at every step. It implied that humans could understand nature directly, through observation, mathematics, and experimentation. It hinted that knowledge might be inherited from the ancient world rather than revealed solely through Scripture. In a medieval society built on absolute theological authority, that idea was explosive. The Church did not fear books lightly. It preserved thousands of manuscripts. It copied Aristotle, Plato, and Roman historians. It tolerated debate, but only within boundaries. This book crossed those boundaries. It blurred the line between faith and reason. It treated the stars as systems, not symbols. It treated the human body as something to study, not merely pray over. And worst of all, it suggested that ancient civilizations, pagans, might have known things medieval Europe had forgotten. That implication alone was enough to make the book dangerous, because medieval Europe depended on a single, carefully structured narrative, that truth flowed downward from God through the Church to humanity. Knowledge outside that chain threatened not only belief, but power. The forbidden book disrupted the chain. Its ideas did not come from Scripture. They came from observation, from ancient sources, from reasoning the Church could not fully control. And this is where the story becomes unsettling. The book did not originate in medieval Europe. It was older. Fragments of its ideas appeared in Greek philosophy, Roman science, Arabic scholarship, and even older traditions preserved in secret. Medieval scholars did not invent it. They rediscovered it. And when they did, they realized its implications were incompatible with the world they lived in. Some tried to reconcile it with faith. Others copied it quietly, believing knowledge itself could not be sinful. But church authorities saw something else. They saw a book that could produce thinkers instead of believers, observers instead of obedient followers, questioners instead of subjects. That was unacceptable. So the campaign began. The book was denounced from pulpits. Owning it became suspicious. Teaching its ideas became dangerous. At first, suppression was subtle. Scholars were warned, manuscripts were discouraged. Certain ideas were labeled pagan or corrupting. When that failed, suppression became forceful. Books were seized, libraries were purged, thinkers were interrogated, and in extreme cases, people died. Not for believing the wrong thing, but for reading the wrong thing. Yet, despite everything, the forbidden book never fully vanished, because it had one advantage over authority. It made sense. It explained natural phenomena without invoking miracles for every event. It connected mathematics to astronomy, medicine to anatomy, geometry to architecture, It treated the world as intelligible and humans as capable of understanding it. That idea is intoxicating. Once someone reads such a book, it cannot be unread. And medieval Europe discovered too late that knowledge spreads even when outlawed. Copies were hidden in monasteries whose abbots secretly valued learning. Translations appeared in unexpected places. Portions of the text were disguised as commentary or allegory. Some scholars encoded its ideas into diagrams, symbols, and marginal notes. The book began to exist without existing. You could destroy the manuscript, but not the understanding it sparked. And that terrified those who tried to control it, because the real danger was not the book itself. The danger was what happened when people realized the Church did not own all knowledge. This is why the forbidden book was not merely banned, it was erased from official history. References to it became vague. Its name shifted, its origin blurred. Eventually, it became easier to deny it ever existed at all. But erasure leaves fingerprints. Ideas do not disappear cleanly. They leave echoes. They resurface where suppression failed. And centuries later, when Europe finally broke free from medieval constraints, those echoes exploded into what we now call the Renaissance. Suddenly, astronomy advanced, anatomy flourished, natural philosophy replaced superstition, and the Church lost its monopoly on truth. That was not a coincidence. It was the delayed consequence of a book medieval Europe tried, and failed, to erase. In the next batch, the mystery deepens as we uncover where this forbidden book came from, what ideas it contained, and why medieval authorities feared it more than any heresy. What made the forbidden book truly dangerous was not a single shocking claim, but the way its ideas fit together. Medieval Europe was accustomed to heresy in pieces. A wrong interpretation of Scripture could be corrected. A rebellious preacher could be silenced. But this book was not a sermon or a manifesto. It was a system, and systems are far harder to destroy than opinions. At its core, the book treated the world as something that could be understood without constant appeal to divine mystery. It did not deny God outright. That would have been easy to condemn. Instead, it quietly reframed God as the origin of natural laws rather than the cause of every individual event. The stars moved according to patterns. The body functioned according to structure. Disease followed rules that could be studied. Nature became legible. And once nature becomes legible, authority begins to weaken. Medieval Europe depended on a carefully maintained hierarchy of knowledge. Theology sat at the top, philosophy beneath it, and practical investigation far below. Observation was permitted only when it confirmed doctrine. This book reversed that order. It placed observation first, reasoning second, and interpretation last. Scripture was not rejected, but it was no longer the starting point. That shift alone was enough to trigger alarm. The book drew heavily from ancient sources that medieval authorities distrusted. It referenced Greek natural philosophers, Roman engineers, and Islamic scholars whose works had entered Europe through Spain and Sicily. These sources described the universe in mathematical terms, not symbolic ones. They spoke of celestial mechanics instead of angels pushing spheres. They described the human body as a physical system rather than a vessel of sin. To the Church, this knowledge was tainted by its origins. Pagan truth was still dangerous truth. Even more troubling was how the book encouraged readers to test ideas for themselves. It did not simply state conclusions, it explained methods. Measure this, observe that, compare results, repeat. In an age where truth flowed downward from authority, the suggestion that truth could rise upward from experiment was revolutionary. A peasant with a compass, a scholar with a lens, a physician with a blade, could all begin asking the same kinds of questions once reserved for theologians. This is why suppression escalated so quickly. Early warnings did not stop the book from spreading. Quiet discouragement failed. Scholars continued copying it because it was useful. It helped predict eclipses. It improved medical treatment. It explained architecture, optics, and motion in ways prayer alone could not. Practical success made the ideas harder to dismiss as mere speculation. Once usefulness entered the equation, fear followed. The Church began associating the book with forbidden arts. Astrology blurred into divination. Alchemy was labeled sorcery. Anatomy became sacrilege. The boundaries between natural philosophy and witchcraft were deliberately blurred, not because they were genuinely identical, but because fear was an effective deterrent. If a book could be linked to damnation, people would hesitate to read it. Public denunciations followed. Sermons warned against false wisdom and curiosity without humility. Universities quietly removed certain texts from their curricula. Libraries restricted access. Monks were instructed to report suspicious manuscripts. Owning the book did not automatically mean execution, but it meant scrutiny. And scrutiny in medieval Europe was rarely gentle. The book's greatest crime, however, was not scientific. It was philosophical. It implied that human reason was capable of approaching truth independently. Not absolute truth, perhaps, but real truth. Partial truth. Usable truth. That idea undermined the Church's role as sole mediator between God and humanity. If people could understand the world directly, then authority became guidance rather than command. That distinction threatened the foundation of medieval power. As pressure increased, the book began to change form. Copies were shortened, certain passages disappeared, diagrams were separated from explanations. Commentaries replaced originals. In some cases, only fragments survived, copied into notebooks or margins. The book became a ghost, existing in pieces that hinted at a whole no longer visible. This fragmentation was not accidental. It was a survival strategy. Scholars who valued the knowledge learned to disguise it. They presented dangerous ideas as hypothetical questions rather than assertions. They attributed bold claims to ancient authorities, distancing themselves from responsibility. They embedded observations within theological language, hoping protection through conformity. Some succeeded, others did not. Trials record accusations of owning prohibited texts, of teaching unauthorized astronomy, of practicing medicine beyond approved doctrine. Punishments ranged from censure to imprisonment to death. These cases were not common enough to spark rebellion, but frequent enough to instill fear. The message was clear. Curiosity had limits, knowledge had borders. Crossing them carried consequences, and yet the book refused to die. It survived because it answered real problems. Crops failed, people fell ill, ships needed navigation, buildings needed stability. Prayers alone could not solve these issues. Knowledge that worked was too valuable to abandon entirely. Even authorities who condemned the book relied indirectly on its principles when they needed results. This contradiction kept the book alive in shadows. It was denounced publicly and consulted privately, officially erased and quietly preserved. Medieval Europe lived in this tension for centuries, balancing fear of heresy against the need for understanding. By the late Middle Ages, something began to shift. The accumulation of fragments reached a tipping point. Scholars noticed patterns across disparate texts. Translators compared Arabic works with Greek originals. Commentaries became bolder. The intellectual climate warmed. Suppression weakened not because authority vanished, but because it could no longer contain what it had tried to erase. The forbidden book never reappeared in its original form, but its ideas resurfaced everywhere, in universities, in workshops, in observatories. What had once been hunted became celebrated. The Renaissance did not create new knowledge from nothing. It unlocked knowledge medieval Europe had tried to bury. And that is the book's final irony. Medieval authorities feared it because it threatened order. They tried to erase it to preserve stability. But by doing so, they delayed understanding rather than preventing it. When the ideas finally emerged, they arrived with even greater force, reshaping Europe completely. The forbidden book was never truly destroyed. It was postponed. The deeper scholars looked, the more unsettling the origin of the forbidden book became. It did not belong neatly to any single author, century, or country. It felt assembled rather than written, as if it were a convergence point where multiple streams of knowledge met. Medieval readers sensed this immediately. The language shifted subtly from section to section. The examples came from different lands. The authorities cited were sometimes Christian, sometimes pagan, sometimes Islamic, and sometimes unnamed entirely. This alone made the book suspicious. Medieval Europe trusted lineage. Knowledge was expected to flow from recognized authorities through approved channels. A book that refused to declare a single parentage was already a problem. What truly alarmed church scholars was that the book seemed to preserve ideas Europe itself had lost. It spoke confidently about Roman engineering methods that no longer existed. It described medical practices more advanced than anything taught in medieval schools. It referenced astronomical calculations that required observational records stretching back centuries. These were not speculations. They were presented as established knowledge. The implication was unavoidable. Earlier civilizations had understood the world better in certain respects than medieval Europe did. That implication struck at the heart of Christian historical thinking. Medieval theology was built on a linear story of salvation, where history moved from darkness toward divine truth. The idea that pagan civilizations possessed advanced knowledge undermined that narrative. It suggested regression instead of progress, loss instead of constant improvement, and loss raised an even more disturbing question. If knowledge could be lost once, it could be lost again. The book also carried an unsettling confidence about the natural world. It treated phenomena like eclipses, tides, and disease as predictable outcomes of underlying processes. There was little sense of fear in its tone. Where medieval sermons spoke of divine punishment, the book spoke of patterns. Where doctrine emphasized mystery, the book emphasized structure. This difference in attitude was subtle but profound. It shifted responsibility. If the world followed laws, then humans were responsible for understanding them. Ignorance could no longer be blamed entirely on divine will. The book's treatment of astronomy was especially controversial. It described the heavens not as a hierarchy of spiritual realms, but as a system governed by motion and measurement. Stars were not just symbols, they were objects following paths that could be calculated. This did not openly contradict Scripture, but it quietly sidelined angels, demons, and miracles. The universe became orderly in a way that left less room for constant supernatural intervention. Medieval authorities understood the danger immediately. A predictable universe reduces fear. Reduced fear weakens control. When people believe that events follow comprehensible rules, they begin to rely less on intermediaries who claim exclusive access to divine explanation. The book did not preach rebellion. It did not need to. Understanding alone was enough. Equally troubling was the book's approach to the human body. Medieval medicine was dominated by tradition, theory, and reverence for ancient authorities whose works were often poorly understood. The Forbidden Book encouraged direct observation. It described organs as mechanical systems. It treated illness as imbalance rather than punishment. This approach produced results. Physicians who followed its principles achieved better outcomes. But success only made suspicion worse. Results that contradicted accepted doctrine threatened the entire medical hierarchy. As the book circulated quietly among scholars, its influence spread unevenly. Some readers focused on its astronomical sections, others on medicine, others on geometry and architecture. Rarely did anyone grasp the entire system. That fragmentation saved it. A fully understood book would have been too dangerous to survive. Fragmented, it slipped through cracks in authority. The Church's response became increasingly aggressive. Lists of prohibited books expanded. The definition of heresy broadened. Curiosity itself became suspect. Terms like dangerous inquiry and unnatural knowledge entered official language. The Forbidden Book was rarely named directly. Naming it would have given it form. Instead, it was referred to obliquely as corrupted wisdom or false science. This vagueness allowed authorities to target ideas without acknowledging their source. Despite this pressure, the book continued to influence European thought indirectly. Builders applied its geometric principles without citing it. Navigators used its astronomical insights without referencing its pages. Physicians adopted its methods while framing them as traditional practice. The book became invisible while remaining essential. This invisibility is why modern historians struggle to trace it. There is no single manuscript to point to, no definitive title to catalog. What survives are echoes, patterns of thought that appear suddenly in medieval Europe without clear origin, techniques that emerge fully formed rather than evolving gradually, ideas that seem older than the texts that record them. The Forbidden Book functioned like a seed bank. Its ideas lay dormant, scattered across disciplines, waiting for conditions to change. When medieval authority finally weakened, those seeds germinated rapidly. The Renaissance did not invent new methods out of thin air. It activated knowledge that had been constrained for centuries. This realization forces a reconsideration of medieval suppression. The Church did not fail to erase the book. It succeeded partially. It delayed the spread of certain ideas long enough to maintain control during a vulnerable period. But it could not eliminate usefulness. Knowledge that solves real problems always finds a way to survive, and this survival created a paradox. By trying to erase the book, medieval Europe preserved it in a more resilient form. Fragmented knowledge is harder to destroy than centralized doctrine. Once dispersed, it cannot be burned in a single fire. The Forbidden Book's greatest legacy, then, may not be what it taught, but how it taught it. It demonstrated that understanding does not need permission, that truth does not require approval, that knowledge, once glimpsed, adapts to survive even under threat. Medieval Europe tried to erase a book. Instead, it created a shadow tradition that reshaped the modern world. As the Forbidden Book dissolved into fragments, something more dangerous than a manuscript began to circulate through medieval Europe, a habit of thought. The book no longer needed to exist as a physical object because its most subversive element had already escaped containment. It taught readers not what to think, but how to think, and that distinction made it far more resilient than any text bound in leather and ink. This habit of thought showed itself first in small, almost invisible ways. Scholars began to compare sources instead of accepting a single authority. Physicians started questioning why certain treatments worked rather than merely repeating them. Astronomers quietly noticed that calculations based on observation produced better predictions than those based on tradition. None of this looked like rebellion. It looked like diligence. But diligence applied to the wrong questions becomes revolutionary. Medieval Europe had inherited a world where certainty was prized above accuracy. Truth was defined by alignment with doctrine, not correspondence with reality. The Forbidden Book reversed that priority. It suggested that reality itself could serve as a judge. If an idea failed to describe the world accurately, it was wrong, regardless of who endorsed it. This was an extraordinary claim in a culture where authority had always outranked evidence. The danger became clearer as this way of thinking spread beyond universities. Artisans, builders, and navigators absorbed its principles indirectly. Gothic cathedrals began incorporating geometry that was not merely symbolic, but structurally optimized. Shipbuilders improved hull designs through experimentation rather than tradition. Farmers adjusted planting cycles based on observation of weather patterns rather than ritual calendars. None of these people read the Forbidden Book, but they benefited from its influence. This diffusion made suppression nearly impossible. The Church could ban manuscripts, but it could not ban methods without crippling daily life. Commerce, agriculture, and construction all depended on practical knowledge. As Europe slowly recovered from centuries of instability, the need for usable understanding increased. Authority faced a dilemma. It could clamp down completely and risk economic collapse, or tolerate limited forms of inquiry while maintaining theological dominance. For a time, it chose compromise. Natural philosophy was permitted so long as it acknowledged theological supremacy. Scholars were allowed to observe, but only within approved frameworks. Results were acceptable if they could be reconciled with doctrine. This uneasy balance held for generations, but it could not last indefinitely. Once people experienced the reliability of knowledge derived from observation, they began to trust it more than inherited explanation. Trust is the foundation of authority. When it shifts, power follows. The Forbidden Book's influence also exposed a deeper vulnerability in medieval Christianity, its dependence on intellectual monopoly. The Church did not fear disagreement as much as it feared competition. A world view that explained nature coherently without constant theological mediation reduced the Church's role from interpreter of reality to interpreter of Scripture. That reduction threatened its central position in society. This is why the response to emerging thinkers grew harsher over time. Figures who pushed observational methods too far were not merely corrected, they were condemned. Their ideas were framed as arrogance, pride, or rebellion against divine order. The charge was not that they were wrong, but that they were dangerous. Danger implied consequence. The line between forbidden knowledge and forbidden person blurred. Yet repression revealed another weakness. Punishing individuals did not stop ideas from spreading. It often accelerated their circulation. Trials turned obscure scholars into symbols. Condemnations drew attention to ideas that might otherwise have remained marginal. Fear discouraged open discussion, but encouraged private study. Knowledge retreated underground, where it became harder to monitor. This underground circulation changed the character of learning itself. Scholars began writing in code, metaphor, and allegory. Diagrams replaced prose. Symbols replaced explanation. Texts became layered, readable only to those who knew how to look. This style was not aesthetic, it was defensive. Knowledge adapted to survive under pressure. Ironically, this adaptation made it more potent. Encoded ideas require active engagement. Readers must think, infer, and reconstruct meaning. This process produces deeper understanding than passive reading. The Forbidden Book, fragmented and disguised, became a training ground for independent thinkers. Its very suppression improved its pedagogical power. By the late medieval period, the accumulation of such thinkers reached a critical mass. Universities expanded, literacy increased. Translation movements brought ancient and Islamic texts into Europe in greater numbers. The intellectual environment became too dense to control effectively. Authority could no longer monitor every book, every lecture, every correspondence. At that point, the forbidden book no longer needed protection. Its core principles had been absorbed into the intellectual bloodstream of Europe. Observation, experimentation, and comparison became acceptable practices, even if their philosophical implications were still contested. The transition was uneven and often violent, but it was irreversible. This is why the book's erasure ultimately failed. You can destroy an object, you can silence a voice, but you cannot easily erase a method once it proves useful. The forbidden book succeeded because it aligned with reality. Reality does not bend to authority indefinitely. It rewards accuracy. It punishes ignorance. Over time, societies that refuse to understand it suffer consequences too severe to ignore. Medieval Europe learned this lesson slowly and painfully. The attempt to erase dangerous knowledge delayed progress, but it also concentrated it. When release finally came, it came with force. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the modern world did not emerge gently. They exploded out of centuries of constraint. The forbidden book was not the sole cause of that explosion, but it was one of its most important catalysts. It represented a different relationship between humans and knowledge, one based on engagement rather than obedience. And that relationship, once formed, could never be fully erased again. By the time medieval authorities realized that suppressing individual texts was no longer enough, the battle had already shifted. The danger was no longer a single forbidden book, but a growing realization spreading quietly across Europe that knowledge could be cumulative, corrective, and independent of theological approval. Once that realization took hold, the logic of censorship began to collapse under its own weight. One of the most unsettling consequences of the forbidden book's influence was the way it altered how people thought about error. Medieval theology treated error as moral failure. To be wrong was not merely to misunderstand, but to stray. The forbidden book introduced a radically different idea, that being wrong was part of the process of understanding. Mistakes were not sins, they were data. Incorrect models could be revised, failed explanations could be improved. Truth was no longer static. It became something approached over time. This idea was quietly revolutionary. A worldview that allows correction cannot be governed by infallibility. Once people accept that even the most respected authorities can be wrong, obedience becomes conditional. Respect shifts from position to competence, and competence must be demonstrated, not declared. The Church sensed this threat instinctively. Its authority depended not on being always correct in matters of nature, but on being unquestionable in matters of meaning. The forbidden book blurred that distinction. If people could question explanations of the physical world successfully, they would eventually question explanations of the moral and spiritual world as well. This is why suppression intensified during periods of crisis. Plagues, famines, and social unrest made authority more sensitive, not less. In unstable times, control over interpretation becomes essential. Competing explanations fracture cohesion. A book that encouraged independent reasoning was not merely intellectually dangerous, it was politically destabilizing, and yet those same crises made the book's ideas more attractive. When prayer failed to stop disease, people looked for patterns. When traditional remedies failed, Physicians experimented. When established explanations could not account for suffering, curiosity replaced certainty. The forbidden book thrived in these cracks. It did not promise comfort, it offered understanding. And in times of chaos, understanding can be more valuable than reassurance. As its influence spread, the book began shaping entire professions without being named. Medicine shifted toward anatomy and diagnosis. Astronomy moved toward precise measurement. Engineering adopted geometry grounded in calculation rather than tradition. None of this required open defiance. It required only that practitioners trust their results more than inherited rules. This practical success created a moral dilemma for authority. Condemning the book outright meant condemning outcomes that benefited society. Better navigation meant safer trade. Better medicine meant fewer deaths. Better construction meant more durable infrastructure. Suppression began to look less like spiritual protection and more like obstruction. To manage this contradiction, medieval institutions adopted a familiar strategy: compartmentalization. Certain forms of inquiry were tolerated so long as they were framed as technical rather than philosophical. One could calculate planetary positions, but not speculate openly about the nature of the cosmos. One could dissect animals, but not humans. One could measure, but not interpret. This compromise bought time, but it did not solve the underlying problem. Measurement inevitably leads to interpretation. Data demands explanation. And explanation invites worldview. The forbidden book had already provided a model for that worldview. It suggested that nature operated according to consistent principles accessible to human reason. Once that assumption took hold, it reshaped every field it touched. What made this shift irreversible was education. As universities expanded, new generations of students encountered fragments of the book's ideas woven into curricula. They learned logic, geometry, astronomy, and medicine in ways that subtly emphasized coherence and causality. Even when instructors remained cautious, the structure of learning itself changed. Students were taught to connect ideas, compare sources, and test assumptions. These students carried those habits into society. They became advisors, physicians, builders, and teachers. They did not need to cite the forbidden book. They embodied it. Suppression had failed because it targeted objects rather than practices. By the late Middle Ages, the Church faced a reality it could not reverse. Knowledge had escaped central control. It no longer flowed only through approved channels. It moved through correspondence, trade, translation, and personal study. The forbidden book had become unnecessary as a single text because its logic had become common currency among the educated. Ironically, this was the book's final protection. Once knowledge disperses widely enough, targeting it becomes counterproductive. Authority risks appearing afraid. Fear undermines legitimacy. The Church gradually shifted tactics again, focusing on guiding interpretation rather than eliminating inquiry altogether. This transition did not happen peacefully. Conflicts erupted. Thinkers were condemned. Boundaries were enforced violently at times. But the long-term trajectory was clear. The forbidden book had changed the rules of engagement. Truth could no longer be defined solely by decree. Understanding could no longer be contained by prohibition. The attempt to erase the book had revealed something authority could not control. That reality itself rewards coherence. Systems that describe the world accurately work. Systems that do not eventually fail. This realization marked the beginning of the end of medieval intellectual monopoly. The Renaissance did not arrive as a sudden awakening. It emerged from centuries of quiet resistance, careful preservation, and adaptive survival of ideas once deemed too dangerous to exist. The forbidden book was never restored in its original form, No triumphant rediscovery ended the story. Instead, its influence dissolved into the foundations of modern thought. It succeeded not by being remembered, but by being absorbed, and that may be the most unsettling outcome of all, because it means medieval Europe did not fail to erase a book, it failed to erase a way of understanding the world. As the forbidden book's way of thinking seeped deeper into medieval Europe, it began to produce a quiet but profound psychological shift. People started to notice that the world behaved consistently, whether or not authority approved of the explanation. Crops responded to soil and weather, not sermons. Disease followed patterns regardless of prayer. Stars moved with mathematical precision, whether anyone understood why. This realization did not destroy faith overnight, but it subtly changed where confidence was placed. For centuries, medieval life had been structured around certainty supplied from above. Explanations flowed downward through hierarchy. God revealed truth to the Church. The Church interpreted it for society, and questioning that structure meant questioning order itself. The Forbidden Book destabilized this arrangement by suggesting that certainty could also rise upward from careful observation. The world itself became a source of authority, and that was a radical reordering of trust. This shift did not announce itself loudly. It showed up in small decisions. A physician trusted experience over tradition. A navigator trusted calculation over folklore. A builder trusted geometry over inherited rules. Each choice seemed practical rather than ideological, but together they formed a new relationship with knowledge. Truth was no longer something received intact. It was something approached, refined, and corrected. Medieval institutions recognized this change instinctively, even when they could not articulate it clearly. The danger was not disbelief, but independence. A population that believes it can understand the world without constant mediation becomes harder to govern. Authority can tolerate dissent of belief more easily than autonomy of reasoning. This is why the response to the Forbidden Book was not merely theological, but psychological. Curiosity itself became suspect. Excessive questioning was framed as pride. The desire to know became a moral issue rather than an intellectual one. The goal was not to prove the book wrong, but to discourage the mental posture it encouraged. Yet discouraging curiosity is far more difficult than banning a text. Humans are pattern-seeking by nature. Once exposed to a framework that makes sense of experience, it is almost impossible to return to blind acceptance. The Forbidden Book did not promise certainty. It promised coherence. And coherence is addictive. It allows the mind to relax, to trust that confusion is temporary rather than fundamental. As this mindset spread, it began to reshape how medieval people thought about time and history. Instead of seeing the past as a simple moral lesson or a static inheritance, they began to view it as a source of lost understanding. Ancient texts were no longer merely authorities to be revered, they became data to be analyzed. The idea that knowledge could be forgotten entered European consciousness. That idea was explosive. If knowledge could be lost, then the present was not automatically superior to the past. Progress was no longer guaranteed. History became something to investigate rather than accept. This realization weakened one of medieval Christianity's most powerful assumptions, that divine truth unfolded steadily through time toward greater clarity. The Forbidden Book quietly suggested the opposite, that humanity could advance, regress, and advance again, that civilizations could peak intellectually and then forget what they once knew. That loss was not always punishment, but consequence. Once that possibility existed, suppression became even more urgent. A society that believes it may have forgotten something important begins to look backward for guidance. It starts questioning inherited structures. It begins to wonder whether authority preserved truth or merely power. These questions destabilize not just religion, but governance, economics, and social hierarchy. And yet, even as suppression intensified, the forbidden book's influence continued to spread because it addressed real needs. Europe was changing. Trade expanded. Cities grew. New technologies demanded understanding rather than ritual. Navigation required astronomy. Construction required mathematics. Medicine required anatomy. The practical world outpaced inherited explanation. Authority could slow this transition, but it could not reverse it without causing collapse. This tension created a strange dual reality. Official doctrine maintained that truth flowed from revelation. Daily practice increasingly relied on observation. People learned to compartmentalize. Faith governed meaning. Reason governed function. For a time, this compromise held, but compromise creates pressure. As generations grew up fluent in calculation, measurement, and experimentation, the boundaries between function and meaning began to blur. If reason worked so well in practical matters, why should it be excluded from deeper questions? If nature followed laws, why should human understanding stop at the altar? These questions did not arise because people became less religious. They arose because they became more confident in their ability to understand. This confidence was the forbidden book's greatest legacy. It did not tell readers to reject authority. It showed them that authority was not the only path to knowledge. That realization alone was enough to change the trajectory of European thought. By the later medieval period, the book's influence had become diffuse but undeniable. It appeared in debates about natural law, in emerging legal theory, in early economic thought, and in philosophical discussions about causation and necessity. The language remained cautious, but the assumptions had shifted. The world was no longer mysterious by default. Mystery had to be demonstrated. This inversion terrified institutions built on unquestionable mystery. And yet, by this stage, eradication was no longer possible. The forbidden book had succeeded not by surviving intact, but by dissolving into a culture that no longer required it as a single source. Its ideas became tools, habits, and expectations embedded in education and practice. Medieval Europe had tried to erase a dangerous book. Instead, it taught an entire civilization how to think without one. And once that threshold is crossed, no amount of censorship can restore the old order. The book was gone, but the silence it left behind was louder than any text ever could be. By the time the forbidden book had dissolved into habits of thought rather than pages of text, medieval Europe found itself facing a contradiction it could no longer resolve cleanly. The very institutions that tried to erase dangerous knowledge depended on its effects to function. Universities trained clerics using logic sharpened by methods the church officially distrusted. Courts relied on legal reasoning shaped by natural law arguments rooted in observation and precedent. Monasteries copied texts whose intellectual foundations came from traditions once labeled suspect. Suppression had become selective, inconsistent, and increasingly symbolic. This inconsistency bred quiet skepticism. People noticed that what was condemned in theory was tolerated in practice. They saw that knowledge was not dangerous when it served authority, but suddenly became sinful when it empowered independence. This realization did not produce open rebellion, but it weakened moral certainty. When rules appear arbitrary, obedience becomes transactional rather than heartfelt. The forbidden book had exposed a fault line between truth and control. As Europe entered the later Middle Ages, that fault line widened. Translation movements accelerated. ancient Greek and Arabic texts entered circulation in unprecedented numbers. Each translation brought with it methods, assumptions, and frameworks that echoed the forbidden book's logic. Even when church scholars attempted to Christianize these works, the underlying structure remained intact. Reason was still reason. Observation was still observation. Once multiple sources reinforced the same way of thinking, suppression lost credibility. No authority can convincingly claim that an idea is uniquely dangerous when it appears independently across cultures, languages, and centuries. The forbidden book's worldview was no longer isolated. It had allies, and allies normalize what was once taboo. At the same time, social conditions were changing. The growth of cities created new classes less dependent on feudal and ecclesiastical authority. Merchants, craftsmen, and professionals valued practical knowledge over doctrinal purity. Their livelihoods depended on accuracy, not orthodoxy. When ideas helped them succeed, moral suspicion mattered less. This shift altered the balance of power subtly but decisively. Authority had once controlled both meaning and method. Now it retained influence over meaning, but method was slipping away. People might still accept religious interpretation of life's purpose, but they no longer relied on it to explain how the world worked. That division reduced the Church's practical authority, even when its spiritual authority remained intact. The forbidden book's influence also changed how failure was understood. In a doctrinal system, failure often implies sin or divine displeasure. In a system grounded in observation, failure becomes information. This reframing reduced fear. If mistakes were part of learning rather than moral judgment, experimentation became less terrifying. Fear had always been a powerful tool of control. The book quietly dismantled that tool by normalizing error as a step toward understanding. Once fear diminished, curiosity expanded, and curiosity does not remain confined to safe topics. It spreads. This spreading curiosity forced medieval institutions into an increasingly defensive posture. New rules attempted to define acceptable inquiry more precisely. New categories of forbidden ideas emerged. The boundary between acceptable and unacceptable knowledge became more complex and harder to enforce. Complexity favors those who navigate it, not those who impose it. Ironically, suppression trained exactly those navigational skills. Scholars learned how to phrase dangerous questions safely. They mastered ambiguity. They developed layered writing styles where surface meanings satisfied authority, while deeper meanings reached perceptive readers. Knowledge became subtle, coded, and resilient. This transformation had long-term consequences. Once knowledge becomes encoded, it is harder to monopolize. Interpretation replaces obedience. Readers must think rather than receive. And thinking, once practiced regularly, becomes habitual. The forbidden book had succeeded in making thinking habitual. By the time early modern thinkers began openly challenging medieval cosmology, they were not inventing a new intellectual posture. They were revealing one that had been cultivated quietly for centuries. When dramatic conflicts finally erupted between authority and inquiry, they appeared sudden only because the groundwork had been laid invisibly. This is why medieval suppression ultimately failed. It treated knowledge as an object rather than a process. You can confiscate a book. You cannot confiscate a method once it has proven its value. You can silence voices. You cannot easily silence habits of mind. The forbidden book did not need to survive physically because it had already changed how survival itself was understood. Knowledge was no longer something fragile that needed protection from error. It became something strengthened by correction. That shift transformed Europe's relationship with truth permanently. Looking back, it becomes clear that medieval Europe did not lose a battle against a book. It lost a battle against inevitability. Once society requires accurate knowledge to function, any system that restricts inquiry will face increasing strain. Suppression can delay change, but delay increases pressure. When pressure finally releases, it does not return to equilibrium. It moves forward. The forbidden book, in its absence, became a catalyst rather than a casualty. It forced authority to reveal its limits. It forced knowledge to adapt and harden. And it forced Europe to confront a reality it could no longer ignore, that understanding the world is not a privilege granted by power, but a necessity demanded by existence. Medieval Europe tried to erase a book to preserve certainty. Instead, it taught itself how to live without it, and in doing so, it ensured that certainty would never again belong to authority alone. As certainty slipped from the hands of authority, medieval Europe entered a period of quiet cognitive tension. Outwardly, society still appeared ordered. Churches dominated skylines, rituals structured daily life, doctrine framed meaning. But beneath that surface, a subtle transformation was underway. People were learning to live with uncertainty, and uncertainty, once tolerated, becomes fertile ground for change. The forbidden book's most lasting impact was that it normalized doubt without glorifying chaos. It did not argue that truth was unknowable. It suggested that truth was provisional, approached through refinement rather than received whole. This distinction mattered enormously. Medieval authority had always framed doubt as spiritual danger, a crack through which heresy entered. The book reframed doubt as a tool, not an end state, but a beginning. This shift altered how people related to explanation itself. Instead of asking whether an idea aligned with doctrine, they increasingly asked whether it aligned with experience. Did it work? Did it predict? Did it solve the problem at hand? These questions did not feel rebellious. They felt responsible. A builder whose structure collapsed could not excuse failure with piety. A physician whose patient died could not rely on prayer alone forever. Practical accountability reshaped intellectual loyalty. Over time, this accountability created a new form of authority, one based not on position but on demonstrated reliability. Those who consistently produced accurate results gained trust, regardless of their status. This dynamic undermined traditional hierarchies quietly but effectively. Power shifted from those who claimed knowledge to those who showed it. The Church responded by attempting to reclaim interpretive control rather than methodological control. It allowed calculation, but insisted on theological framing. It allowed observation, but demanded doctrinal conclusions. This strategy worked temporarily, but it contained a flaw. Once people learned to trust methods independently, they began to notice when conclusions felt forced. Forced explanations erode confidence. As more educated Europeans encountered inconsistencies between doctrine and observation, they learned to compartmentalize belief. Faith governed ultimate meaning. Reason governed immediate reality. This compromise reduced conflict, but it also reduced integration. The unified worldview medieval Christianity depended on began to fragment. The forbidden book had not intended fragmentation. It sought coherence. But suppression produced unintended consequences. When authority restricts synthesis, knowledge does not vanish. It separates. Astronomy drifts from theology. Medicine drifts from morality. Natural philosophy drifts from metaphysics. These separations weaken any system that relies on unity for legitimacy. Ironically, the Church had once preserved knowledge precisely because it unified meaning. By trying to control inquiry, it accelerated division. This division created space for new institutions to emerge. Universities became centers of cautious experimentation. Guilds became sites of practical innovation. Courts began to rely on evidence and precedent rather than ritual alone. Even monasteries, long symbols of preservation, became places where dangerous texts were quietly studied under the guise of commentary. The Forbidden Books' ideas thrived in this environment because they offered coherence without centralized control. They could be applied locally, adapted to context, and improved incrementally. Knowledge became modular. No single authority needed to sanction it entirely for it to function. This modularity made erasure impossible. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe had changed intellectually, even if it had not fully acknowledged that change culturally. People still spoke the language of faith, but they increasingly thought in terms of cause and effect. They still revered tradition, but they tested it. They still feared heresy, but they no longer feared curiosity itself. This shift prepared the ground for open rupture. When figures later challenged geocentrism, ecclesiastical monopoly, and inherited cosmology, their ideas did not appear from nowhere. They resonated because the mental habits required to accept them already existed. The Forbidden Book had trained Europe to receive such challenges long before they were voiced publicly. This explains why suppression eventually became reactive rather than preventative. Authority no longer stopped ideas before they formed. It responded after they spread. That is the moment control is already lost. The Forbidden Book's legacy, then, was not the specific knowledge it preserved, but the intellectual immune system it created. Europe learned how to evaluate claims, how to revise models, and how to tolerate uncertainty long enough to reach better explanations. This immune system made Europe more resilient, but also more restless. Once people learn that understanding is possible, ignorance becomes intolerable. Once they experience coherence, contradiction becomes unbearable. Once they realize that authority can be mistaken, obedience becomes conditional. These realizations reshaped not only science, but politics, religion, and identity itself. Medieval Europe tried to erase a book to protect stability. What it actually erased was the illusion that stability could be maintained by controlling knowledge. The Forbidden Book revealed that stability rooted in ignorance is temporary, and authority that fears understanding is ultimately fragile. By the time Europe entered the early modern era, the battle over the book was no longer relevant. The book had already won by losing its physical form. It had dissolved into a culture increasingly defined by inquiry rather than inheritance. This is the quiet paradox at the heart of the story. The Forbidden Book did not survive despite suppression. It survived because of it. And the civilization that tried to erase it became the civilization most transformed by its absence. By the time medieval Europe reached this stage, suppression had achieved something no authority ever intends. It had made knowledge feel inevitable. Once inquiry becomes woven into daily problem-solving, people stop asking whether they are allowed to think a certain way and start asking why anyone would want to stop them. At that point, censorship no longer feels protective. It feels irrational. This change was not dramatic. There were no mass awakenings, no sudden rejection of belief. Instead, a quiet confidence settled in. People learned that the world could be trusted to behave consistently. That trust altered how they related to explanation. Instead of clinging to certainty, they learned to live with provisional understanding. And provisional understanding, unlike dogma, invites improvement. The Forbidden Book had normalized this posture long before it disappeared. Its greatest achievement was teaching readers that uncertainty was not a void to be feared, but a space to work within. Medieval Europe had once treated unanswered questions as spiritual dangers. Now they became intellectual invitations. This shift reshaped education profoundly. Students no longer memorized authorities merely to repeat them. They compared authorities. They noticed contradictions. They learned that disagreement did not always signal error, but sometimes signaled complexity. This approach did not destroy reverence for tradition, but it redefined it. Tradition became a starting point, not a boundary. That redefinition had political consequences. A society trained to compare sources becomes difficult to rule through proclamation alone. Laws must make sense. Policies must work. Explanations must hold up against lived experience. Authority becomes accountable in ways it never was before. Even when rulers retained power, they lost intellectual monopoly. This loss of monopoly did not immediately weaken institutions, but it changed their behavior. They became more defensive, more reactive, more concerned with managing perception than cultivating understanding. The forbidden book had shifted the terrain from belief to credibility. Credibility is fragile. Once people begin evaluating claims based on coherence rather than origin, trust becomes conditional. This conditional trust extended beyond religion into medicine, law, and governance. The world was no longer explained by reference alone. It demanded justification. This demand produced anxiety among those whose authority rested on unquestioned acceptance. The response was predictable. They framed independent reasoning as arrogance. They warned that too much knowledge corrupted humility. They equated questioning with rebellion. These warnings worked for some, but not for all, because results kept contradicting fear. Navigation improved, architecture advanced, commerce expanded. Life expectancy, though still low, benefited from incremental medical improvements. These successes reinforced the legitimacy of the methods behind them. The forbidden book's worldview did not promise paradise. It delivered reliability. Reliability is persuasive. It does not need belief. It does not need loyalty. It only needs repetition. Each successful application of observational reasoning reinforced confidence in the process. Each failure became an opportunity for refinement rather than condemnation. Over time, this created a culture more tolerant of error and less tolerant of stagnation. Stagnation had once been a virtue. Stability was equated with righteousness. The forbidden book inverted that value subtly. It suggested that stagnation was dangerous because it allowed error to persist unchallenged. Improvement required movement. Understanding required revision. These ideas seeped into moral thinking as well. People began to question whether suffering was always meaningful or simply unnecessary, whether poverty reflected divine will or structural failure, whether injustice could be corrected rather than endured. The line between natural philosophy and social philosophy blurred. Authority noticed. The danger was no longer confined to laboratories or libraries. It had entered ethics. If systems could be improved, then responsibility followed. Responsibility invites judgment. Judgment invites reform. This is why the forbidden book frightened medieval Europe more than open heresy ever could. Heresy challenges belief. The forbidden book challenged structure. It implied that the world could be organized differently, more rationally, more fairly, more effectively. Such implications destabilize any system that depends on inevitability. The church and ruling elites responded by doubling down on tradition, ritual, and symbolism. These tools reinforced identity even as explanatory power weakened. For a time, this strategy worked. People continued participating in inherited structures even as their internal relationship to knowledge changed, but internal change accumulates. By the late medieval period, Europe was intellectually prepared for transformation, even if it was not socially ready to admit it. The forbidden book had already done its work. It had trained minds to expect coherence, to tolerate uncertainty, and to value methods over declarations. When open conflicts between authority and inquiry finally erupted, they were explosive precisely because they released centuries of accumulated pressure. The scientific revolution and Reformation were not sudden ruptures. They were delayed consequences. This delay obscures the forbidden book's role, because when historians look backward, they search for visible texts, public debates, and named authors. The forbidden book left few such traces. Its influence operated beneath visibility, shaping habits rather than manifestos. This invisibility made it more powerful. Ideas that announce themselves invite opposition. Ideas that reshape expectation quietly become normal. By the time authority reacts, the change has already occurred. Medieval Europe believed it was erasing a dangerous book. What it actually erased was the illusion that truth could be frozen. Once that illusion vanished, the future became open in ways the past had never been. Knowledge could grow, correct itself, and adapt. That adaptability would eventually produce modern science, modern governance, and modern identity. With all their benefits and risks, the forbidden book did not create modernity, but it made modernity unavoidable. And that may be the most dangerous thing a book can ever do. Once modernity became unavoidable, medieval Europe faced the most unsettling realization of all. The forbidden book had not merely survived suppression, it had reshaped the very criteria by which truth was judged. The struggle was no longer about which ideas were allowed, but about how ideas proved themselves. And that shift placed authority in a position it had never been designed to occupy. For centuries, power rested on the assumption that certainty must come from tradition. What was old was trusted, what was inherited was correct, what was sanctioned was safe. The forbidden book inverted that logic quietly but relentlessly. It suggested that truth was not guaranteed by age or approval, but by correspondence with reality. Ideas earned credibility through performance, not pedigree. This transformation produced a crisis that medieval institutions could not easily articulate. They could still command obedience, but they could no longer command conviction in the same way. People continued to follow rules, attend rituals, and profess belief, yet internally their confidence had shifted. When explanations failed to match experience, belief adapted. Outward conformity masked inward revision. This internal split changed the nature of faith itself. Faith had once been inseparable from explanation. To believe was to accept a worldview whole. Now belief became layered. People believed in God, but not always in the explanations offered for natural events. They believed in moral order, but questioned whether suffering was divinely ordained. They believed in authority, but evaluated its claims selectively. This selectivity was unprecedented. It meant that belief could coexist with doubt without collapsing. It meant that obedience could exist alongside skepticism. And that meant control was no longer absolute. The forbidden book had introduced a dangerous compatibility, faith without intellectual submission. From the perspective of authority, this was worse than disbelief. An unbeliever could be excluded. A skeptic could not. Skepticism operated quietly, invisibly, eroding certainty from within. It did not announce itself. It simply withheld trust until evidence appeared. This new posture spread through every domain it touched. In law, precedent began to matter as much as decree. In medicine, outcomes mattered more than tradition. In commerce, accuracy mattered more than ritual. In education, demonstration mattered more than memorization. Each domain reinforced the same expectation. Explanations should work. Working explanations accumulate loyalty faster than commanded ones. By this stage, medieval Europe was no longer trying to erase a book. It was trying to preserve a worldview that no longer matched how people navigated reality. That mismatch created anxiety. Anxiety produced reaction. Reaction intensified control. But intensified control only highlighted the gap between authority and experience. The forbidden book's absence sharpened this gap, because without a single text to condemn, authority struggled to define the threat clearly. It could not point to one manuscript and say, "This is the danger." The danger was everywhere and nowhere. It lived in methods, expectations, and habits of mind. It lived in the quiet confidence of people who had learned that understanding was possible. This made suppression increasingly symbolic. Bans were issued more to signal power than to eliminate ideas. Trials reassured the faithful that boundaries still existed. Condemnations demonstrated vigilance. But beneath the surface, inquiry continued. In some cases, suppression even backfired, lending forbidden ideas an aura of importance they might not otherwise have gained. Nothing attracts curiosity like prohibition. The forbidden book had become a paradoxical presence. It was absent, yet influential, unnamed, yet everywhere implied, erased from catalogues, yet embedded in practice. Its disappearance forced authority to fight a ghost, and ghosts cannot be imprisoned. This struggle marked the end of the medieval intellectual order, even before political structures changed. Once authority loses its monopoly on explanation, its claims must compete. Competition introduces standards. Standards introduce accountability. Accountability transforms power. The forbidden book did not advocate rebellion, but it made obedience conditional. Conditional obedience is the seed of reform. By the time open challenges to ecclesiastical authority erupted, the intellectual groundwork had long been laid. People were ready not because they were angry, but because they were confident. They had learned to trust methods that produced results. They had learned that correction was possible. They had learned that truth could be approached rather than received. This readiness is often misunderstood by later historians who focus on dramatic events and charismatic figures. But revolutions of thought rarely begin loudly. They begin when enough people quietly stop believing that existing explanations are the only ones available. The forbidden book helped produce that moment. Its disappearance ensured that no single authority could claim ownership of its ideas. They belonged to anyone capable of using them. That universality made them unstoppable. Ironically, had the book survived openly, it might have been debated, contained, or even domesticated. By vanishing, it avoided fixation. It became adaptable. It merged with local needs, disciplines, and languages. It evolved. This adaptability made it stronger than any preserved manuscript. Medieval Europe tried to erase a dangerous source of knowledge. In doing so, it taught knowledge how to survive without a source. It forced ideas to detach from objects and embed themselves in practice. Once that happened, the future could no longer resemble the past. Authority could still guide belief. It could still enforce ritual. It could still command loyalty. But it could no longer dictate how truth was discovered. And that loss, more than any heresy, marked the true end of medieval certainty. The forbidden book did not destroy the medieval world. It simply made it impossible for that world to remain unchanged. Once the criteria for truth shifted from permission to performance, medieval Europe entered a phase of profound intellectual instability. The old structures did not collapse immediately, but they no longer rested on solid ground. Authority could still command obedience, but it increasingly struggled to command explanation. And explanation, more than obedience, shapes how societies imagine their future. What made this moment so volatile was that it produced two Europes living side by side. One Europe still spoke the language of medieval certainty, ritual, and inherited meaning. The other Europe operated quietly according to principles of testing, revision, and provisional truth. Most people belonged to both at once. They prayed sincerely, attended church faithfully, and yet made practical decisions based on experience rather than doctrine. This dual existence was not hypocrisy. It was adaptation. Adaptation always precedes transformation. The Forbidden Book had normalized the idea that knowledge could improve over time. Once that belief took hold, the past stopped being sacred simply because it was old. Antiquity became a resource rather than an authority. Ancient texts were read not to confirm doctrine, but to extract methods. Scholars compared Aristotle with Arab astronomers, Galen with empirical anatomy, Scripture with observable nature. These comparisons produced tension, but also insight. Insight is dangerous to static systems. Static systems rely on closure. Questions must end somewhere. Answers must be final. The Forbidden Book had taught Europe to leave questions open long enough for better answers to emerge. That openness undermined the finality medieval authority depended on. This is why debates began to change tone. Earlier theological disputes revolved around interpretation of sacred texts. Later, debates increasingly involved evidence, measurement, and demonstration. Even when conclusions remained orthodox, the reasoning behind them had shifted. People wanted explanations that made sense, not just explanations that were sanctioned. This demand altered the emotional texture of belief. Faith no longer rested solely on submission. It had to coexist with understanding. When understanding failed, faith adapted rather than disappearing. But adaptation weakened uniformity. Belief became personal. Interpretation diversified. The shared mental world medieval Europe relied on began to fragment. Fragmentation creates choice. Once people realize that multiple explanations can coexist, allegiance becomes selective. Individuals choose which explanations to trust in which contexts. This choice-making process is subtle but transformative. It trains people to evaluate rather than accept. The Forbidden Book had trained Europe to evaluate. As evaluation spread, authority faced a narrowing range of options. It could reform itself to accommodate inquiry, or it could harden its boundaries and risk irrelevance. Different institutions chose differently. Some monasteries became centers of learning. Others retreated into orthodoxy. Some universities encouraged debate. Others imposed limits. This uneven response accelerated change rather than slowing it. Where inquiry was tolerated, it flourished. Where it was suppressed, it migrated. Scholars moved, ideas traveled. Knowledge followed the path of least resistance. Medieval Europe did not modernize uniformly. It modernized asymmetrically, creating intellectual hotspots surrounded by conservatism. These hotspots mattered. They demonstrated that alternative arrangements were possible, that learning could thrive without collapsing social order. That questioning did not inevitably produce chaos. Every successful example weakened the argument for suppression elsewhere. The Forbidden Book's influence was now structural rather than textual. It had altered expectations. People expected explanations to be coherent. They expected claims to be defensible. They expected authority to justify itself. Justification is exhausting for systems built on reverence. Over time, the cost of maintaining unquestioned authority rose. Enforcement required surveillance. Surveillance bred resentment. Resentment undermined legitimacy. Legitimacy, once lost, is difficult to recover. Meanwhile, the practical benefits of inquiry continued to accumulate. Better maps expanded trade, improved engineering stabilized cities, more accurate calendars improved agriculture. Each success reinforced confidence in methods derived from the Forbidden Book's worldview. Success creates its own authority. That authority does not need symbols, rituals, or threats. It persuades by outcome. When methods work repeatedly, they earn trust. Trust spreads socially. It becomes expectation. By the late medieval period, Europe had internalized a new expectation, that the world should be understandable. Mystery still existed, but it had to justify itself. Unexplained phenomena were no longer accepted passively. They were problems to be solved. This expectation marked a psychological turning point. Once a society expects understanding, ignorance becomes intolerable, not morally sinful, but practically unacceptable. Systems that cannot explain themselves lose credibility. Authority that cannot adapt loses relevance. The Forbidden Book did not force this expectation violently. It seeded it quietly. Its disappearance ensured that no single institution could claim ownership of the change. It belonged to the culture itself. This cultural shift explains why later confrontations between authority and inquiry were so dramatic. They were not about isolated ideas. They were about incompatible expectations. One side expected obedience, the other expected explanation. These expectations could not be reconciled indefinitely. The medieval world had tried to protect certainty by erasing a book. What it ultimately erased was the possibility of unquestioned certainty itself. Once people learned that understanding could grow, stagnation became failure. Once they learned that truth could be revised, infallibility became suspect. The Forbidden Book did not overthrow medieval Europe in a single moment. It taught Europe to outgrow it. And outgrowing a worldview is far more permanent than rejecting one. Once Europe had outgrown the medieval intellectual framework, it found itself in an unfamiliar and uncomfortable position. The old certainties had not vanished, but they no longer felt sufficient. Authority still existed. Belief still mattered. Ritual still structured life. Yet beneath all of it ran a quiet awareness that the world could be understood more deeply than tradition alone allowed. This awareness did not bring peace. It brought tension. A society that begins to suspect it has been thinking inside limits it did not choose becomes restless. That restlessness was the final consequence of the Forbidden Book. It was no longer about what the book said, or even how it said it. It was about the realization that something essential had been withheld, delayed, or constrained. Knowledge, once tasted, leaves a residue. Even when suppressed, it changes expectations. People begin to sense gaps in explanation. They notice when answers feel incomplete. They feel the weight of unanswered questions more acutely than before. Medieval Europe entered this phase gradually. People continued living within inherited structures, but the emotional relationship to those structures changed. Obedience became negotiated. Belief became layered. Trust became conditional. The Forbidden Book had taught Europe that understanding was not all or nothing. Partial insight was still insight. Imperfect explanation was still better than silence. This shift altered how power was perceived. Power had once been justified by access to truth. When truth became accessible through methods rather than mediation, power had to justify itself differently. It leaned more heavily on tradition, identity, and fear. But fear works best when ignorance is complete. When people understand even a little, fear loses precision. It becomes blunt, less persuasive. At the same time, knowledge began to feel cumulative. Each generation built slightly more than the last. Small improvements added up, techniques refined, errors corrected. This accumulation contradicted the medieval sense of timeless order. The world no longer felt static. It felt unfinished. An unfinished world demands participation. Once people believe their actions can improve understanding, passivity becomes frustrating. Waiting for revelation feels inadequate. This psychological shift mattered as much as any intellectual argument. The forbidden book had not only taught methods, it had reshaped motivation. It encouraged engagement rather than submission. This engagement spread unevenly but relentlessly. It appeared in workshops where craftsmen experimented with materials, in universities where students debated sources, in courts where evidence began to matter, in navigation where accuracy meant survival, in medicine where outcomes mattered more than tradition. Each domain reinforced the same lesson: explanations should work. As this lesson permeated society, medieval Europe faced a paradox. The very tools it needed to thrive were the tools that undermined its inherited worldview. To survive materially, it needed inquiry. To survive ideologically, it needed restraint. Balancing these needs became increasingly difficult. The forbidden book sat at the heart of this paradox, even in its absence. Its disappearance meant there was no single target to attack, no clear boundary to enforce. Authority could not point to one heretical volume and say, "This is the problem." The problem was everywhere. It was in questions, in comparisons, in experiments, in expectations. This made reaction less effective. Crackdowns became symbolic gestures rather than solutions. They reassured those who feared change, but they did not reverse it. The intellectual tide had turned. Knowledge had become a process rather than a possession. Once knowledge is understood as a process, erasure becomes impossible. You can destroy records, you can silence teachers, but you cannot stop people from noticing patterns. Patterns assert themselves through repetition. The sun rises. Bodies heal or fail predictably. Structures stand or collapse according to principles. These realities teach regardless of permission. The forbidden book merely accelerated awareness of what reality was already doing. This is why the book's erasure ultimately changed nothing fundamental. It delayed integration, but it could not prevent it. It fragmented knowledge, but fragmentation made it more adaptable. It pushed ideas underground, but underground networks are often more resilient than centralized institutions. By the time Europe approached the threshold of the early modern world, the forbidden book's work was complete. It had transformed how people related to explanation. It had weakened the equation of authority with truth. It had normalized the idea that understanding grows through engagement rather than obedience. What followed was inevitable. The structures of medieval certainty could not contain a culture that expected coherence. Conflicts erupted not because people became irrational, but because their standards for explanation had changed. When standards change, systems must adapt or fracture. Medieval Europe fractured. But that fracture was also a birth. Out of it emerged new forms of knowledge, new institutions, and new ways of organizing society. These developments carried their own risks and contradictions, but they were built on a foundation the forbidden book had helped lay: the conviction that the world is intelligible and that humans can participate in understanding it. The book itself did not survive to witness this transformation, but its absence had shaped everything. Because in trying to erase a dangerous source of knowledge, medieval Europe revealed a truth it could not contain: that understanding, once awakened, does not need permission to continue. And that realization marked the true end of the medieval mind, not with a dramatic rupture, but with a quiet refusal to stop asking why. By the time medieval Europe reached this point, the forbidden book had completed its most subtle transformation. It had shifted the center of gravity of knowledge away from institutions and into the minds of individuals. This shift did not announce itself with revolutions or manifestos. It manifested as a growing internal confidence that truth could be approached through effort rather than granted through status. This confidence changed how people related to authority in ways that were difficult to measure but impossible to reverse. Authority no longer felt absolute, it felt provisional. Medieval society had long functioned on the assumption that order depended on fixed answers. God's will explained the world. The Church interpreted that will. Questioning interpretation risked chaos. But the forbidden book had quietly demonstrated that order could also emerge from understanding. Patterns could be discovered, causes could be traced, effects could be predicted. Stability did not require mystery at every level. Once that realization took root, mystery itself changed meaning. Mystery was no longer something that shut inquiry down. It became something that invited it. Unknowns were not warnings to stop, but signals to look closer. This reframing altered the emotional experience of learning. Fear gave way to curiosity. Curiosity gave way to confidence. Confidence gave way to expectation. Expectation is dangerous to static systems. When people expect explanations to improve, they stop tolerating stagnation. When they expect errors to be corrected, they stop accepting infallibility. When they expect coherence, contradictions stand out sharply. The forbidden book had cultivated these expectations slowly, precisely because it was not always visible. Its ideas entered Europe through translations, commentaries, marginal notes, diagrams, and practices. They were absorbed piecemeal, adapted to context, and reinforced by success. No single authority could isolate or discredit them because they did not originate from a single source. This diffuse origin protected the ideas. It also meant that suppression efforts became increasingly misdirected. Authorities targeted texts while methods flourished. They condemned individuals while habits of mind spread. They enforced boundaries that no longer aligned with how people experienced the world. This misalignment produced cognitive dissonance. People continued participating in inherited structures, but they no longer believed those structures fully explained reality. This gap between participation and conviction widened over time. Rituals continued, but interpretation diversified. Faith persisted, but it became more personal, less centralized. The forbidden book had helped create a distinction medieval Europe had never fully embraced before: the difference between belief and explanation. Once separated, the two could no longer reinforce each other automatically. This separation did not immediately weaken religion. In many cases, it strengthened personal faith by freeing it from explanatory burden. But it weakened institutional authority by removing its monopoly on meaning. Institutions had to negotiate with reason rather than command it. Negotiation implies equality. Equality between authority and inquiry was unthinkable in earlier centuries. Now it was becoming unavoidable. This transformation also changed how Europe related to error and failure. Instead of viewing mistakes as moral shortcomings, people increasingly saw them as opportunities for refinement. This attitude reduced fear of experimentation. Reduced fear encouraged innovation. Innovation produced results. Results reinforced confidence. The cycle fed itself. The forbidden book's disappearance ensured that this cycle belonged to no one in particular. It could not be claimed, canonized, or fully condemned. It became cultural rather than textual. And cultural shifts are far more durable than written ones. By the late medieval period, Europe had crossed a threshold it did not yet recognize. It had learned how to think historically, not in the sense of recording events, but in the sense of understanding change over time. Ideas could improve, systems could evolve, practices could be replaced. This historical consciousness undermined one of the medieval worldview's core assumptions, that truth was fixed and timeless in its human expression. Once people accept that understanding changes, they stop equating age with accuracy. Tradition becomes informative rather than decisive. This reorientation reshaped education profoundly. Learning was no longer about preserving inherited answers intact. It became about engaging with them critically. Students compared authorities rather than memorizing them. Teachers encouraged argument within limits. Debate became a legitimate tool rather than a sign of disrespect. These changes seem modest individually. Together, they redefined intellectual life. The forbidden book had not demanded rebellion. It had offered a model of engagement. That model proved more persuasive than confrontation ever could. People adopted it because it worked, because it solved problems, because it made sense of experience. And once a model works consistently, abandoning it feels irrational. This is why attempts to restore medieval certainty failed. They were trying to reimpose a worldview that no longer matched lived reality. People could still believe deeply, but they could not unlearn coherence. They could still obey, but they could not unsee patterns. The forbidden book had permanently altered perception. Even those who never encountered its ideas directly felt its effects. Social systems began to assume literacy, numeracy, and reasoning. Commerce relied on calculation. Law relied on evidence. Governance relied increasingly on administration rather than ritual alone. These developments did not eliminate hierarchy, but they changed its justification. Authority had to demonstrate competence. It had to adapt. It had to explain itself. Explanation had become a requirement, not a courtesy. This requirement marked the end of the medieval intellectual era more decisively than any political event. When people expect explanations that correspond to reality, systems based on unquestioned tradition cannot endure unchanged. The forbidden book did not overthrow medieval Europe by force. It taught Europe to outgrow it. And outgrowing a worldview is irreversible, because it changes not just what people know, but what they expect knowledge to do. Once those expectations shift, no erasure can restore the old order. The book was gone, but the way of thinking it introduced had become permanent. And permanence, not preservation, was its greatest triumph. By the time the forbidden book's influence had fully permeated European thought, something irreversible had occurred. Medieval Europe no longer trusted silence as an answer. Where earlier generations had accepted mystery as closure, later generations experienced it as tension. Unanswered questions no longer felt spiritually reassuring. They felt unfinished. This emotional shift was subtle, but it changed everything. For centuries, authority had relied on the idea that some truths were simply beyond human reach, and that accepting this limit was a virtue. The forbidden book did not openly deny limits, but it quietly reframed them. It suggested that limits were temporary rather than permanent, conditional rather than absolute. What could not be understood now might be understood later. What was mysterious today might be intelligible tomorrow. This idea destabilized patience. Patience had once been a religious discipline. Waiting was holy. Endurance was meaningful. The forbidden book transformed waiting into a problem to be solved. Time was no longer something endured passively. It became a dimension in which understanding advanced. Once this temporal shift took hold, the medieval worldview began to feel cramped. If understanding could grow, then deferring explanation indefinitely became irresponsible. If knowledge could improve, then maintaining ignorance was no longer humility, it was neglect. These realizations did not immediately overthrow authority, but they altered how people judged it. Authority began to be evaluated by its responsiveness. Institutions that adapted retained influence. Those that resisted hardened into irrelevance. This divergence explains why some medieval structures survived into the modern era while others collapsed. Flexibility became a survival trait. The Forbidden Book had introduced flexibility at the level of thought. It encouraged comparison rather than allegiance. It rewarded revision rather than repetition. It normalized the idea that explanations should change when evidence demanded it. These values conflicted directly with systems built on permanence. Permanence had once been a virtue. Now it looked like stagnation. This revaluation altered moral reasoning as well. People began to ask whether suffering was inevitable or preventable, whether poverty was divinely ordained or structurally produced, whether injustice reflected cosmic order or human failure. These questions did not arise from rebellion, but from coherence. If causes could be traced, then responsibility followed. Responsibility is destabilizing. A worldview that locates causes in divine mystery limits accountability. A worldview that locates causes in systems invites reform. The Forbidden Book, by treating the world as intelligible, implicitly encouraged responsibility for outcomes. This encouragement did not produce immediate revolution. It produced unease. Unease is often more powerful than outrage. Outrage burns quickly. Unease lingers. It keeps questions alive. It prevents closure. Medieval Europe entered a long period of intellectual unease where inherited answers felt increasingly insufficient, but alternatives were not yet fully articulated. This in-between state is where the Forbidden Book did its deepest work. It taught Europe to live without final answers while refusing to accept permanent ignorance. That balance is difficult. It produces anxiety, experimentation, conflict, and growth all at once. Societies in this state feel unstable not because they are collapsing, but because they are transforming. Transformation is rarely comfortable. As this unease spread, it reshaped how people understood authority itself. Authority was no longer defined solely by lineage, sanctity, or tradition. It became associated with competence. Those who could explain, predict, and solve problems gained influence regardless of their formal status. This shift altered social dynamics quietly but decisively. Merchants who understood markets gained leverage over nobles who did not. Physicians who produced results earned trust over those who relied on ritual alone. Engineers who built structures that stood were valued over those who followed inherited rules blindly. Expertise began to matter. Expertise does not replace hierarchy overnight, but it erodes its absoluteness. The Forbidden Book had made expertise thinkable as a source of legitimacy. Once that happened, power could no longer rest comfortably on position alone. It had to justify itself through effectiveness. Effectiveness is measurable. Measurable outcomes introduce comparison. Comparison introduces evaluation. Evaluation introduces change. The chain reaction was slow, but it was relentless. By the end of the medieval period, Europe was no longer a society that could fully return to inherited certainty, even if it wanted to. Too many people had learned to ask why. Too many had experienced the reliability of explanations grounded in observation. Too many had seen improvement result from inquiry. The Forbidden Book had permanently altered Europe's emotional relationship with knowledge. Knowledge was no longer something that reassured by closing questions. It reassured by opening them in productive ways. This inversion marked the true psychological end of the medieval era. Political structures would lag behind, religious conflicts would erupt, violence would accompany transition. But the intellectual shift was already complete. People expected understanding. Once that expectation exists, no amount of erasure can remove it. The Forbidden Book had not only challenged doctrine, it had changed desire. People desired explanations that worked. They desired coherence. They desired progress that made sense of experience. Desire is the hardest thing to control. You can police behavior. You can censor text. But you cannot easily extinguish a desire that has been learned. Medieval Europe tried to erase a book because it threatened certainty. What it ultimately erased was the belief that certainty could be imposed from above indefinitely. The book's absence forced Europe to confront a deeper truth, that understanding is not a gift granted by authority, but a process sustained by engagement. Once that truth is internalized, the old world cannot return. And the Forbidden Book, long after its pages were gone, continued to teach exactly that. By the time Europe crossed fully into this new mental landscape, the Forbidden Book no longer needed defenders or critics. Its role had shifted again, this time from catalyst to reference point. Not something people argued about directly, but something implicitly assumed whenever they approached the world as intelligible, improvable, and open to investigation. What had once been shocking now felt natural, and when ideas feel natural, they are almost impossible to uproot. This normalization marked the final failure of medieval erasure. For centuries, suppression had depended on the belief that dangerous ideas could be isolated, named, and destroyed. But the Forbidden Book had demonstrated a truth authority never fully grasped. Ideas that describe reality accurately do not remain confined to texts. They migrate into tools, practices, expectations, and language itself. Once that migration occurs, censorship becomes symbolic rather than effective. The most telling sign of this change was how younger generations learned. Students no longer approached knowledge primarily as inherited wisdom to be memorized. They approached it as material to be worked with. Even when curricula remained conservative, the act of learning had changed. Comparison, argument, and application became central. Knowledge was something you did, not something you merely received. This shift redefined intelligence itself. Intelligence was no longer measured by how well someone could recite authority. It was measured by how effectively they could solve problems, integrate information, and adapt to new evidence. That redefinition altered social status quietly but decisively. Those who mastered methods gained influence, even when they lacked noble lineage or ecclesiastical rank. Influence began to detach from tradition. This detachment did not immediately dismantle medieval hierarchies, but it weakened their internal coherence. When competence becomes visible, privilege becomes questionable. When results matter, inherited status feels arbitrary. The Forbidden Book had not attacked hierarchy directly, but it had undermined the logic that sustained it. The consequences extended beyond intellectual life into morality and identity. People began to see themselves less as passive recipients of divine order and more as participants in shaping outcomes. Responsibility expanded, agency grew, fatalism receded. This did not eliminate faith, but it transformed it. Faith became less about explaining the world and more about orienting oneself within it, meaning separated from mechanism. This separation reduced conflict in some areas but intensified it in others. When religion no longer controlled explanation, it had to renegotiate its role. That negotiation was not peaceful. Conflicts erupted because expectations had changed. People no longer accepted suffering as inevitable without question. They no longer accepted ignorance as virtue. They no longer accepted authority that could not justify itself. The forbidden book had trained them not to. Ironically, the Church itself contributed to this outcome by preserving and transmitting knowledge it could not fully control. Monasteries copied texts. Universities taught logic. Clerics debated philosophy. Each act of preservation strengthened the very habits that undermined intellectual monopoly. This irony reveals something crucial about the nature of suppression. Suppression rarely eliminates what it opposes. More often, it forces adaptation, and adaptation produces resilience. The forbidden book survived not by resisting authority, but by teaching knowledge how to survive without authority. Once that lesson was learned, the trajectory of European thought changed permanently. Knowledge became something that belonged to no single institution. It became a shared enterprise, distributed across professions, regions, and disciplines. This distribution made it harder to corrupt, harder to monopolize, and harder to erase. Erasure requires concentration. Distribution defeats it. By the late medieval and early modern period, Europe had internalized this distributed model. Printing would soon accelerate it dramatically, but the conceptual groundwork was already laid. People expected access. They expected explanation. They expected participation. These expectations defined the modern world more than any single invention. The forbidden book's disappearance ensured that no single narrative could contain its influence. It became part of Europe's intellectual DNA rather than a chapter in its history. Its absence was not a void, but a space in which inquiry flourished. Looking back, it becomes clear that medieval Europe misunderstood the nature of the threat. It feared the book because it appeared to undermine faith. What it actually undermined was control over understanding. Faith could survive that loss. Control could not. This misunderstanding explains why suppression focused on texts rather than on education, practice, and method. Authority attacked symptoms rather than causes. By the time it recognized the deeper shift, it was too late to reverse. The forbidden book had already succeeded. It had changed how people evaluated truth. It had changed what people expected from explanation. It had changed how knowledge justified itself. These changes did not require the book to survive physically. They required only that its ideas make sense to enough people, often enough, in enough contexts. They did. This is why the forbidden book remains relevant long after medieval Europe faded. Its story is not just about censorship or heresy. It is about the limits of control in the face of reality. It is about what happens when societies try to freeze understanding rather than allow it to grow. Every era faces this choice: protect certainty or pursue coherence, preserve authority or tolerate inquiry, control knowledge or adapt to it. Medieval Europe chose preservation first. History shows what followed. The forbidden book was never truly erased. It was absorbed, and once absorbed, it ensured that Europe would never again be a place where understanding waited for permission to exist. Once the forbidden book had been absorbed rather than preserved, Europe entered a phase where the struggle over knowledge no longer looked like a battle between books and flames, but a tension between momentum and restraint. The old methods of control were no longer sufficient, yet new frameworks had not fully stabilized. Society moved forward intellectually faster than it could reorganize itself socially, and that imbalance produced both extraordinary breakthroughs and violent backlash. This is the point where history often simplifies the story incorrectly. It becomes tempting to say that medieval Europe lost and modern Europe won, as if the transition were clean or inevitable. It was neither. The habits of thought seeded by the forbidden book did not produce harmony. They produced friction. They challenged assumptions faster than institutions could adapt. And when institutions lag behind cognition, conflict follows. The same reasoning that improved medicine and navigation also destabilized religious unity. The same skepticism that corrected astronomical models also questioned political legitimacy. Once people learned to test claims against reality, no claim remained immune forever, not even those that had once seemed eternal. This was deeply unsettling. Certainty had provided psychological shelter for centuries. It told people where they stood in the universe, what was expected of them, and why suffering occurred. The forbidden book did not remove meaning, but it redistributed responsibility. Understanding now required effort. Truth required engagement. Meaning required construction. Many embraced this challenge. Others resisted it fiercely. Resistance is often misunderstood as ignorance, but it is more accurately fear of disorientation. When a worldview collapses, people lose not just explanations, but identity. They lose the sense that their lives fit into a fixed cosmic order. The forbidden book, by encouraging inquiry, forced people to confront uncertainty without guaranteeing comfort. That confrontation was too much for some. This explains why periods of intellectual progress were accompanied by intense reaction. New ideas were not rejected because they failed, but because they succeeded too well. They revealed that the old maps of reality no longer matched the territory, and when maps fail, people either redraw them or cling to them harder. Europe did both. Some regions embraced inquiry openly, reorganizing education, governance, and belief around evolving understanding. Others doubled down on tradition, enforcing orthodoxy with renewed intensity. This divergence produced fault lines that would shape centuries of conflict. The forbidden book's influence was evident on both sides. Those who embraced inquiry inherited its confidence in coherence. Those who resisted inherited its threat. Even rejection was shaped by the book's legacy. Authority became more rigid precisely because it sensed its explanatory monopoly slipping. Ironically, this rigidity accelerated decline. Rigid systems cannot adapt to changing conditions. They mistake stability for strength and uniformity for unity. The forbidden book had taught Europe, whether it wanted to learn or not, that adaptability was a form of intelligence. Systems that refused to adapt eventually fractured. This pattern repeated across domains. In religion, refusal to accommodate inquiry produced schism. In politics, refusal to reform produced revolution. In economics, refusal to adjust produced collapse. The forbidden book did not cause these outcomes directly, but it removed the intellectual justification for stagnation. Once people believed that systems could be improved, tolerance for immobility vanished. Another unintended consequence of erasure was acceleration. Because the book did not survive as a single reference, Europe had to reconstruct its ideas repeatedly, independently, and imperfectly. This reconstruction process produced variation. Variation produced competition. Competition produced rapid innovation. Had the book survived intact, its authority might have slowed change by fixing interpretation. Instead, fragmentation forced creativity. Scholars approached similar problems from different angles. Solutions multiplied. Errors were corrected faster because no single model dominated completely. This distributed innovation became one of Europe's defining characteristics. Knowledge no longer advanced through preservation alone, but through tension between models. Debate replaced reverence. Hypothesis replaced inheritance. Revision replaced repetition. The forbidden book had taught Europe not what to think, but how to evolve thinking itself. And that evolution came with cost. Certainty eroded, unity fractured, conflict intensified. The same intellectual freedom that enabled progress also enabled division. People disagreed more because they were thinking more. Agreement required argument rather than obedience. This is the price of inquiry. Medieval Europe had tried to avoid that price by erasing a dangerous book. Instead, it delayed the cost and increased its magnitude. When inquiry finally broke free, it did so explosively, reshaping society in ways no single authority could manage. Yet even in conflict, the forbidden book's deeper lesson endured. Reality does not submit to control indefinitely. Understanding cannot be frozen without consequence. Systems that suppress inquiry weaken themselves over time. These lessons were learned painfully, but they were learned. By the end of this transformation, Europe was no longer a civilization defined by inherited certainty. It was defined by contested understanding. Truth became something argued over, tested, and revised. This made society noisier, less stable in some ways, but far more adaptable. The Forbidden Book had not promised utopia. It had promised intelligibility, and intelligibility, once tasted, cannot be forgotten. Even those who longed for the old certainty could not unlearn what they had seen. The world made sense in ways it never had before. Causes replaced miracles in daily life. Systems replaced symbols. Explanation replaced resignation. This did not eliminate wonder. It relocated it. Wonder was no longer found only in mystery. It was found in coherence, in the realization that the universe could be understood, even partially, by human minds. That realization, more than any single text, marked the true end of medieval erasure. The Forbidden Book was gone. But the expectation it created, that understanding should be possible, had become irreversible. And from that point forward, no civilization shaped by that expectation could ever fully return to silence. By this stage, the Forbidden Book had ceased to be a historical object and had become something far more consequential, a silent standard against which explanations were measured. Even without knowing its name, people sensed when an answer was incomplete. Even without reading its pages, they felt when authority relied too heavily on command rather than coherence. This internal calibration was the book's final and most enduring legacy. What made this shift irreversible was that it changed not just institutions, but self-perception. Medieval people had once understood themselves primarily as receivers of truth. Meaning arrived from above. Wisdom flowed downward. Human responsibility lay in obedience and endurance. The Forbidden Book quietly replaced this self-image with another. Humans as participants in understanding, fallible, limited, but capable. Capable of noticing patterns, capable of correcting errors, capable of refining explanations over time. This new self-image altered how people interpreted failure. Failure was no longer a sign of moral deficiency alone. It became evidence of incomplete understanding. This distinction mattered deeply. When failure invites inquiry rather than shame, learning accelerates. When learning accelerates, systems must adapt or fracture. Authority struggled with this change because it undermined a foundational emotional tool: fear of being wrong. Fear had long maintained order by discouraging deviation, but the Forbidden Book had taught Europe that being wrong was survivable, even useful. Wrongness became temporary rather than catastrophic. Once fear of error diminishes, curiosity flourishes. Curiosity, however, is inherently destabilizing. It does not respect boundaries. It moves from one domain to another, connecting ideas that were once kept separate. Astronomy bleeds into philosophy, Medicine bleeds into ethics. Economics bleeds into governance. The medieval world had relied on compartmentalization to maintain control. The forbidden book dissolved compartments. This dissolution explains why later conflicts were not isolated debates, but cascading crises. When authority lost control of explanation in one area, its credibility weakened elsewhere. Doubt spread horizontally rather than vertically. People questioned not just what they were told, but why certain people were entitled to tell them. Entitlement itself became questionable. Once people learned that understanding required effort rather than status, legitimacy shifted subtly toward competence. Those who demonstrated insight gained influence regardless of rank. This shift did not eliminate hierarchy, but it changed its justification. Hierarchy could no longer rely solely on tradition. It had to perform. Performance can be measured. Measurement introduces comparison. Comparison introduces choice. Choice introduces agency. Agency was the one thing medieval authority had never intended to distribute widely. The forbidden book distributed it anyway. Even resistance to inquiry bore the mark of this change. Those who defended tradition increasingly framed their arguments in rational terms rather than purely theological ones. They appealed to order, stability, and social cohesion. This rhetorical shift revealed an important concession. Explanation now mattered. Authority could no longer say, "because it is so," and expect acceptance. That concession alone marked defeat. The book had forced authority to adopt the language of reason, even when opposing it. Once that language is adopted, the game changes. Claims become contestable. Arguments can be evaluated. Outcomes matter. Over time, this contestability reshaped not just knowledge, but identity. People began to see themselves less as members of a fixed cosmic hierarchy and more as agents within evolving systems. This perspective encouraged planning, reform, and innovation. It also produced anxiety because it removed guarantees. Guarantees had once been comforting. The forbidden book replaced comfort with possibility. Possibility is thrilling, but it is also frightening. It demands responsibility. It removes excuses. It forces societies to confront the consequences of their choices rather than attributing them to fate. This confrontation defined the transition out of the medieval world more than any doctrinal dispute. Once people believed that outcomes depended on understanding, stagnation became culpable. Ignorance became a liability rather than a virtue. The irony is that medieval Europe tried to erase the forbidden book precisely to avoid this burden. It sought to preserve a world where meaning was secure and responsibility limited. Instead, it created a world where meaning had to be constructed and responsibility expanded. This expansion was uneven and often violent. Some embraced it eagerly, others resisted desperately. The resulting conflicts shaped centuries of European history. But regardless of outcome, the underlying expectation persisted. Explanations should work. That expectation still defines the modern world. We inherit it every time we demand evidence, every time we revise models, every time we tolerate uncertainty long enough to improve understanding. These habits feel natural now, but they were once radical enough to justify erasure. The forbidden book was dangerous because it aligned thought with reality rather than authority. Reality is unforgiving. It does not negotiate. It rewards accuracy and punishes error, regardless of belief. Once people learned to trust that feedback, no system built on immunity from correction could survive unchanged. The book's absence ensured that this lesson could not be monopolized. No single institution could claim to be its heir. No doctrine could freeze its meaning. Its influence remained diffuse, adaptable, and resilient. It belonged to anyone willing to engage with the world as it is, rather than as it is declared to be. This diffusion protected the lesson across generations. Even when new forms of authority emerged, they inherited the same vulnerability. They too would be judged by performance. They too would face correction. The Forbidden Book had universalized accountability. That may be its most subversive achievement. Not that it challenged medieval Europe alone, but that it made every future system subject to the same test. Does your explanation work? If it does, it survives. If it does not, it will be replaced. No erasure can stop that process indefinitely. The Forbidden Book disappeared because it taught Europe something power could not afford to teach openly at the time. But once learned, it could not be unlearned. Understanding had become expected, and expectation, once embedded, becomes destiny. The medieval attempt to erase a book ended by erasing the conditions that made erasure possible. What remained was a civilization permanently changed by an absence it could never again ignore. When the story finally comes to rest, the most unsettling conclusion is not that medieval Europe failed to erase a forbidden book, but that it revealed something it never intended to expose, that knowledge, once awakened, cannot be controlled by force, tradition, or silence. The book itself was never the true danger. The danger was the realization it planted, that understanding answers to reality first, not authority. Medieval Europe tried to erase the book because it threatened certainty. Certainty was the foundation of order. It told people who they were, where they belonged, and why the world behaved as it did. The Forbidden Book did not attack that order directly. It did something far more destabilizing. It showed that explanations could improve, that causes could be traced, that errors could be corrected, that truth could be approached rather than inherited. Once people internalized that idea, the medieval world could never fully return to what it had been. This is the paradox at the heart of the story. The book was feared because it undermined control, yet the act of suppressing it taught Europe how fragile control truly was. Authority learned how difficult it is to police curiosity. Society learned how resilient understanding can be when it aligns with experience. Both lessons would shape the centuries that followed. The Forbidden Book did not destroy faith. Faith adapted. What it destroyed was the assumption that faith must also explain the mechanics of the universe. Meaning and mechanism separated. Belief remained powerful, but explanation became negotiable. That separation altered everything, from science to politics to personal identity. For the first time, large numbers of people began to live with the idea that the world could make sense without being fully closed, that not knowing was not failure, but an invitation. That uncertainty was not a threat, but a space for growth. These ideas sound ordinary now. In the medieval world, they were revolutionary. The Church and other authorities sensed this intuitively. They understood that once people expect coherence, they stop tolerating stagnation. Once they learn that systems can improve, they begin asking why improvement is resisted. Once they realize that explanations can be tested, they stop accepting declarations at face value. This is why the Forbidden Book was hunted so relentlessly. Not because it was evil, not because it was false, but because it worked. It worked too well. It produced better medicine, better navigation, better construction, better reasoning. It made people less afraid of being wrong and more committed to finding out what was right. It encouraged engagement rather than submission. That engagement was incompatible with a world built on unquestioned authority. And yet, the attempt to erase the book achieved something unexpected. By forcing knowledge underground, it made it adaptive. By fragmenting ideas, it made them harder to destroy. By banning texts, it encouraged methods. By suppressing explanations, it trained minds to reconstruct them independently. The forbidden book survived precisely because it disappeared. Its absence ensured that no institution could ever claim ownership of its legacy. No single doctrine could freeze its meaning. No authority could decide when inquiry should stop. The ideas became cultural rather than textual, embodied rather than archived. This is why the modern world exists at all. Not because medieval Europe failed to defend tradition, but because it taught itself, unintentionally, how to live without absolute certainty. It taught itself how to tolerate doubt without collapse. It taught itself how to revise understanding without losing meaning. Those lessons were expensive. They came with conflict, fragmentation, and suffering. They still do. A world without fixed answers is harder to live in than a world governed by certainty. But it is also a world capable of adaptation, correction, and growth. The forbidden book forced that choice. Looking back, it becomes clear that the book was never meant to be remembered as a single work. Its purpose was transitional. It existed to bridge a moment when inherited explanations no longer matched lived reality. Once that bridge was crossed, the book itself became unnecessary, even dangerous, because clinging to it would have replaced one form of authority with another. Instead, what survived was something far more powerful, a habit of questioning, an expectation of coherence, a willingness to revise. These are not ideas that can be burned. They live in how societies teach, argue, govern, and imagine their future. They surface whenever someone asks not "who said this?" but "does this work?" They reappear whenever explanation is demanded instead of obedience. They persist whenever authority is measured against reality rather than tradition. Medieval Europe tried to erase a book to preserve order. What it ultimately erased was the belief that order could be maintained by controlling understanding. That belief has never fully returned. Every attempt to suppress knowledge since then has encountered the same resistance, not always immediate, not always successful, but inevitable. Reality pushes back. Curiosity adapts. Understanding finds a way to survive. The forbidden book's story is not a warning about heresy. It is a warning about fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear of change, fear of a world that cannot be fully closed. History shows that fear delays transformation, but it cannot prevent it. Knowledge aligned with reality does not disappear. It waits, it fragments, it hides, and when conditions are right, it returns, not as a book, but as a way of thinking. That is the final irony. Medieval Europe tried to erase the forbidden book because it feared losing control. What it actually lost was the ability to ever fully control knowledge again. And in that loss, the modern world was born.